All right, welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today we're diving into a really fascinating tension. We live in this hyper-modern, super fast-paced, and let's be honest, often pretty skeptical world. But right in the middle of all of it sits this multi-millennia-old text that is still provoking intense debates, inspiring billions of people, and literally shaping the foundations of our global culture. And whether you approach it as a believer, a total skeptic, or maybe just a curious student of history, the cultural footprint of the Bible is absolutely undeniable. Which brings us to a super practical question. Why on earth should anyone read a 2,000-year-old collection of texts today? It's kind of a crazy paradox, actually. It remains the most printed book in all of human history, and yet, so many people today have never even opened it to see what's inside. So, in this explainer, we're going to take an objective look at what the source material and current research actually tell us about why this text is still so relevant. Okay, let's dive right into this.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to objectively answer why this text remains relevant by exploring its impact across 5 totally distinct domains. Understanding our everyday language, appreciating a literary masterpiece, uncovering ancient historical mysteries, improving your mental well-being, and finally, discovering meaning and wisdom.
Starting right off with reason number 1, understand our everyday language and the surprising origins of common phrases.
You might actually be surprised to learn just how much ancient scriptures are woven directly into the daily speech and pop culture we consume right now. Like, even if you've never read a single page, you probably quote it all the time. Phrases like stumbling block, sign of the times, and drop in a bucket, they sound like totally modern idioms, right? You probably recognize Sign of the Times as a massive Harry Styles song or maybe a Prince album. Ashes to Ashes was a huge hit for David Bowie, and Queen famously sang Another One Bites the Dust. But get this. Before they were pop culture hits, or lines you maybe assumed came from Shakespeare, these exact phrases originated in the Bible. Live by the sword, die by the sword comes directly from the Gospel of Matthew, while a drop in a bucket is straight out of the book of Isaiah. It's just this really charming, unexpected crossover between ancient texts and our modern conversations. And it goes even deeper when we look at the 1611 King James translation. The linguistic impact here is staggering. This translation essentially built the modern English language, seamlessly embedding itself into the rhetoric of historical giants from Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King. But here's the part that is truly astounding. While Shakespeare worked his absolute literary magic with a massive, prodigal vocabulary of around 31,000 words, the King James Bible achieved its monumental global influence using a surprisingly concise vocabulary of just 12,000 words. Think about that. It is literally a masterclass in the power of linguistic economy. Moving on to reason number 2. Appreciate a literary masterpiece by reading stories as stories and poetry as poetry. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how scholars at the Candler Foundry point out that approaching this text purely as literature, actually accounting for genre and tone, totally elevates our understanding of it. A lot of times people try to read this ancient text like it's some rigid instruction manual. And look, an instruction manual is great if you're trying to assemble a bookshelf, but it doesn't exactly change how you feel or how you see the world. Well, the Bible isn't written like a manual at all. It's a rich compilation of Hebrew poetry, incredibly complex narratives, personal letters, and parables. When you step back and read it as literature, just letting the stories be stories and the poetry be poetry, it opens you up to its deeper motifs. It actually has the power to alter attitudes towards your community and shape your identity in ways a rigid list of rules just can't do. That brings us to reason number 3. Uncover ancient historical mysteries through archaeology and the preservation of text. In our modern age of skepticism, it's super easy to just dismiss ancient writings as, mere folklore. But the hard science of archaeology has actually stepped in to provide some very objective historical anchors here. Let's trace this incredible historical journey. For a very long time, scholars only had relatively recent manuscripts to work with, but that completely changed in the 20th century. In 1947, near Jericho, explorers made this unbelievable discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran. We're talking ancient clay jars holding tattered parchment texts that were full 1,000 years older than any previously known Old Testament manuscripts. No way, right? And what did they reveal? Well, by comparing texts like the Isaiah scroll to modern versions, archaeologists essentially proved that copyists had preserved the text with remarkable accuracy for millennia. It is an absolute marvel of historical preservation.
And this brilliantly illustrates our transition into reason number 4, improve your mental well-being. Looking at the neuroscience of contemplative reading. So we're basically moving from the dusty caves of archaeology right into the modern neuroscience lab to look at how ancient reading practices physically affect our brains today. To really get this, we first need to define an ancient practice called Lectio Divina, which literally translates to divine reading. Originating way back in early monastic traditions, this is a slow, meditative method of reading sacred texts. The goal here isn't to speed read or just gather factual information. Instead, it's all about engaging the text to foster contemplation, empathy, and a really deep sense of connection. It's an exercise designed to unite the mind in peaceful contemplation rather than just endlessly scanning for data.
And this is where the hard science comes in. Recent fMRI studies, like the ones conducted by researcher Jeffrey Sachs, reveal what actually happens inside the brain during this kind of contemplative reading. When we deeply engage with a narrative, mentally imagining the situations and the characters, it literally activates regions of the prefrontal cortex associated with empathy and conscientious attitudes. Regularly practicing this kind of slow, meditative reading actually enhances your neuroplasticity. Psychologically speaking, it helps regulate emotions, allowing people to replace anxiety-evoked memories with a trustful awareness and mental peace. It's wild to think that ancient monks basically discovered intuitively what neuroscientists are just now proving with brain scans.
Which leads us to our final point, reason number 5, discover meaning in wisdom, moving from information to transformation.
Let's move to this next concept and see how it builds on that idea of mental well-being. Look, there is a massive gap between just studying a text academically and actually applying it for personal transformation. To bridge that gap, a lot of people use what's called the Inductive Bible Study Method. It breaks down into 3 super practical steps. First up, look, objectively observing what the passage actually says. Second, learn, understanding what it means in its original context. And third, live, asking yourself, okay, how must I respond to this? This is exactly how readers are able to extract deep, life-altering principles, things like humility, generosity, and resilience during suffering, and actually wire them into their daily habits.
And the impact of finding this meaning is profound, for sure, especially as we get older. There was this recent narrative study published in the International Journal of Indian Psychology that looked specifically at older adults who regularly read religious scriptures. The researchers referenced this really powerful idea by Herman Feifel. He said, life's ultimate meaning remains obscure unless it is reflected upon in the countenance of death. Wow. The study basically found that engaging with these texts helped older adults find real mental peace, it greatly improved their interpersonal relationships, and it gave them a highly positive, purpose-driven understanding of mortality.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Whether you view this text as a linguistic treasure trove, a literary masterclass, an archaeological marvel, a tool for neurological well-being, or just a really deep well of life wisdom, how will you approach reading this ancient text? Could exploring it influence your own vocabulary, broaden your historical perspective, or maybe even fundamentally shift your daily mindset? It's a text that has absolutely shaped our world, and it's definitely worth exploring for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep seeking out the structures that help us understand our world.